So welcome to the panel session. I think right on time we have our third panelist joining. So welcome to today's panel session of the first HDR conference organized by the Center for Cybersecurity Research and Innovation. So some housekeeping. I think it's been this session has been going on since a few hours ago, but I would just like to remind everyone to please keep your mic mute and camera off during the panel discussion, of course, except our kind panelist members. Please post your questions to the panel to the chat section, chat box, and in the second half of the panel, it's actually dedicated to the questions that we have by our attendees. So today's panel is around the topic of what is next for cybersecurity tech. I think within the context of today's HDR conference, it is important to remind ourselves as academics of the importance of conducting impactful research. I think to achieve this, we need to aim for bridging the gap that we all know that exists between our industry and academia. And I think this active collaboration and engagement between academia and industry and government is actually one of the distinguishing factors and top priorities for our Center for Cybersecurity Research and Innovation. So with this mindset and goal, our panelists today are experts from industry with leadership roles who have kindly agreed to join us today and share their insights about what is next for cybersecurity tech. So today, panel members are Rachael Leighton. So I'll just go through a quick introduction. So Rachael works in the strategy and influence team in Operations Security and Enablement networks and IT at Telstra. She has a passion for human psychology and cyber culture uplift with a creative and people-focused skill set. Rachael uses her creative approach combined with a deep understanding of cyber frameworks and standards to bridge the gap between the board, senior executives, stakeholders, and security specialists, changing the way they think about cybersecurity whilst giving them the tools they need to make a difference. So welcome, Rachael. Great to have you here with us today. We have also Vaughan Shanks. Vaughan is the CEO of Cydarm Technologies, a company that is enabling cyber resilience through better and faster security operations. I've followed your talks at RSA conference, and when you presented your early startup back then, I think through the quick pitch, that was very interesting. Previously, Vaughan worked as a software engineer in a range of federal government positions and has a PhD in computer science from RMIT University. So for our HDR members here, great to have you here with us, Vaughan, and I think you're an inspiration for many of our HDR students who might be keen to explore alternative pathways to work in academia after doing a PhD. So great to have you again. So next in our panel is Gareth Chandler. Gareth is the A&Z Director for Digital Shadows. He has been working in IT sales for over 10 years. Gareth enjoys helping organizations of all sizes solve complex problems through technology. So I've stalked you on LinkedIn, Gareth. I know some very big companies that you've worked at, as well as your current role. So I think, and this applies to all of our panelists. So I think it's not just about this role. I think over the years, your experiences will be very insightful to our HDR students and our academics here today. So thanks for joining, Gareth, and thanks for making the time to join the panel today. So without further ado, allow me to start the discussion. So I'll just perhaps start with the question that all of us may be thinking when we meet people like our panelists. So, we all know cybersecurity is always evolving, constantly changing, but in your roles and in your capacity in the organizations and in that you're leading, what are the most recent trends you've observed? So maybe I'll start with Gareth.
Thanks for that introduction. So I'd probably like to talk about three sort of key trends that I think most prevalent in the last kind of 6 to 12 months that we've certainly seen in my industry and seen kind of across the board. So the sort of first thing I guess, which is a pretty major one for all organizations, is the rise of ransomware. So ransomware has been a hot topic for a while now, but surprisingly, it hasn't got better. It's gotten a lot worse. And I think it's been accelerated by the pandemic situation over the last kind of couple of years. And what we're seeing is there's a few sort of key trends which are quite worrying. So one of the things is the rise of ransomware as a service. This is, you could almost think of it as a democratization of cybercrime, that a lot of cyber criminals are not actually doing the ransomware themselves. They're basically contracting or subcontracting it out to specialists who do ransomware. And the other thing, which is kind of similar, is the use of initial access brokers to actually gain entry into organizations. So I guess the combination of this means that the technical barrier to entry for cyber criminals is significantly lower than it was before. So essentially, you can find somebody to get you access into an organization. You can buy zero-day exploits. You can hire somebody to basically execute the ransomware attack. So what this means for organizations is that cyber crimes become a lot more prevalent. There's not the level of expertise that was needed before, and we're seeing it become more widespread because of this. So it's all quite worrying. So ransomware is definitely something that is a big problem. And then also on the topic of ransomware, we've seen the modus operandi of threat actors change a little bit as well. So previously, ransomware was all about encrypting and denying access, basically, to an organization's IT resources. But now we're seeing that in some cases that hasn't been too successful. So the cyber criminals have pivoted a little bit, and we're seeing this technique called double extortion popping up now, which is very, very worrying trend. So basically, if an organization says, look, I don't care, I've got backups, or go ahead, I'll just take the loss and try to recover my files my own way. Cyber criminals are now in a lot of instances saying, okay, fine, you don't care about your files, but what if we release them to the public? And we've seen this in some quite high profile cases. There was a local government, I think it was in Johannesburg, where this happened, and they basically threatened to release all the data to the public. And this is very, very hard to prevent against, even if you have backup, if you have a great cyber resiliency policy. If someone's gone and actually exfiltrated your data, it's almost impossible to stop them posting this on the dark web. There's very little jurisdiction or ability to actually prevent that. So that's another very worrying trend, and we see that probably on the rise and becoming worse in the next year or so. The other thing that we're seeing is a big trend now is business email compromise. So this is becoming an incredibly lucrative form of attack for cyber criminals, and they're getting a lot more sophisticated about it as well. So rather than your generic sort of phishing email or even like a spear phishing type of email, we're seeing now criminals kind of insert themselves in the email chains and hijack email chains. So very difficult to spot and very, very sort of easy to execute. So we're seeing this as a very lucrative form of cyber attack, which is also on the uprise as well. And then the other thing, which everybody who's been following cybersecurity news over the last 6 months will be across, is supply chain attacks. So supply chain attacks are not a new thing, but what's new is the level of sophistication that's actually required to execute these. So previously we saw supply chain attacks tended to be the highest level of sophistication. They were sort of nation state actors initiating these. And as let's say an average sort of organization that probably wouldn't have been a high profile target for a foreign state actor, you didn't really have too much to worry about. But now there's obviously sort of collateral damage in most supply chain attacks. But now we're seeing that it's sort of gone a lower tier of threat actor. So we're seeing a lot of ransomware groups. An example would be the Excellion attack back in April, I think it was. That was actually Clop ransomware group, and that was actually executed by chaining together 6 different zero-day vulnerabilities. So very sophisticated attack, but it was by a ransomware group rather than nation-state actors. So that's another thing I think everyone can expect to see more of in the future and to be aware of. So yeah, those are probably the top 3 things for me.
No, I think that's very interesting, and you touched on perhaps if I were to categorize them, a technology aspect and maybe the email threat or the email risk you mentioned. Maybe it falls on the human aspect in one way or the other. I don't know. I'm just thinking about it in my head. But and we have 2 panel members. Maybe one can continue that focus on the technology side, but I think Rachel perhaps can view it from the human aspect. So that would be, so I think we are off to a great start. So thanks, Gareth. So maybe Rachel, so we start with the human aspect. What sort of trends you see in your role in terms of as they're evolving?
Thanks, Arash. Look, I think Gareth absolutely sums it up. Just like all of us, this rapid digital transformation that we've seen across all sectors of our community have enhanced the risk, because just as we are now using that technology, so are our cyber criminals. As Gareth mentioned, I think seeing ransomware increasing and coming from different actors, also seeing that supply chain and third-party risk. One of the other things that we're also kind of seeing, and maybe it's not so much around big organisations, but maybe some of those smaller mum and dad organisations, or even those that were more traditionally bricks and mortar that have had to transition to a clicks and mortar style of operating, have introduced a new layer of risk that maybe they are not aware of or don't have that depth of understanding of. So just as all of us have embraced IoT or cloud computing, so have our threat actors. They're doing it at scale. So I think it's what we're seeing from that human element is really around maybe those smaller organisations that don't have that same level of robust cyber capability, but also an understanding. We're seeing their risk profiles increase. So we need to start thinking about how we might be able to work together to minimise the risk of our small third party and supply chain deliverables.
No, sounds great, and perhaps we can get on solution side in the next few questions. I have many more questions, and I'm sure our HDR attendees and conference attendees will have many as well. But just to also hear one insights on the technology side, and so I think in your role, focusing on in your as a CEO of Cydarm, was focusing on faster security operations. Maybe the supply chain aspect might be relevant to focus on. So I don't know, what are the cyber risks that you've observed and you worry about, one?
Yeah, so the trends that that I'm seeing, and this is at a very macro level, and I will say, so yeah, thanks to the other panelists who've sort of stolen a bit of my thunder, but I think that's good that we're all in sync, that we all recognise the common problems here. I call it the 3 R's. So you've got ransomware, as very clearly articulated by Gareth, remote work, which I think both of you mentioned, and what this has done is resulted in a large proliferation of hastily erected infrastructure that has just rapidly increased the attack surface that attackers have to choose from. There's just now a plethora of options, really. You've got, as an attacker, that asymmetry has been sort of magnified by remote work. So ransomware, remote work, and the 3rd R, because I like things that start with the same letter, is regulation. And so this is really picking up all around the world. Case in point, I think it was on Tuesday evening of this week that the upper house of Parliament here in Australia passed the SOCI Amendment Bill. So what this is security of critical infrastructure across 11 industry sectors. And I think higher education is one of them, in fact. I'd have to go and check my notes, but it covers roughly half the economy. And this is putting a reporting burden on organisations that are breached to report to government regulators that this has happened. And there are very stringent deadlines around how you report that once you become aware of an incident. So I think that, and you've seen some big fines being dished out in, for example, Europe with GDPR. The Americans, you've got CCPA and other similar legislation. It sort of all revolves around this kind of 72-hour reporting window where you have to tell a government authority within 72 hours in most of these. This is where the regulations are somewhat harmonized, and there are penalties for not protecting the data. I think the way organizations used to think with customer data is, heads we win, tails you lose, right? So if we get attacked and customer data is stolen, maybe we take a temporary hit to the share price. But ultimately, if we don't have any disruption to continuity of operations, where's the real damage to the organisation? Maybe some reputational damage. If your local supermarket chain got attacked and your customer data was stolen, would you refuse to buy groceries there anymore, or would you say, actually, the other supermarket, the red one down the road, is a bit too far away. I'm going to keep shopping at the green one, right? So there's no real consequences unless you change the equation, put some incentives in there, and make it like impose cost on the custodians of your data. And I think that's what governments are waking up to, and that's what they're doing. And that, of course, has implications for the defenders that are trying to keep these organizations and the data they're holding safe. Yeah, so that's my three.
No, thanks very much. I think we've gradually moved from perhaps the risks and to the regulations and all that, moving towards the solution, perhaps. So maybe Gareth, in relation to your point about ransomware, in your role and as part of your organization. So I'm guessing that probably is the threat that you also worried about. So how do you manage it? So what are the best practices that you have to minimize the threats that affect your organization directly? Or maybe how do you even identify those best practices? That may also be interesting to know.
Sure, great question, Arash. Thanks for that. So you're correct. I think it's probably pretty safe to say ransomware is the biggest concern for most CISOs and most organizations. That's the one I'd say if you want to pick something which keeps people up at night, that would be the one. And as Vaughan mentioned, it's not just about the reputational damage. It's also now there's a lot of financial punitive sort of measures being taken against companies that aren't doing their due diligence and taking steps to kind of protect their customers and employees' data. So it's certainly a very big concern. Often it's very, very simple things that organizations can actually do. So I think Rachael touched on this. We're seeing pretty rapid digital transformation that was forced on a lot of companies that maybe would have taken a lot longer normally, but they didn't really have a choice due to the global pandemic. And that means a lot of corners were cut, unfortunately, in a lot of instances. So security was compromised in the name of agility and kind of business productivity and being able to get on with business. So now there's actually a bigger attack surface than ever for attackers to go after. And there's a lot of gaps and weak chains in the security that, unfortunately, a lot of organizations aren't actually aware of in a lot of cases. So I'd say sometimes it just comes down to basic security hygiene, having a proper framework in place and actually being aware of if the threat exposure, what your attack surface actually is and what the risk is. I'll give you an example of a very high profile attack, which was executed pretty easily by the attackers. So everyone's probably familiar with the Colonial Pipeline hack, which is actually partly responsible for some of this new regulation we're seeing in Australia. That was actually executed by locating a fairly unsecure VPN endpoint. And then it was actually just using a shared password. So no two-factor authentication, a password that had been used across multiple services. Very, very easy attack, very low barrier to entry for the attackers, but obviously extremely lucrative and extremely damaging for the company in question. And you know, for I guess globally as well, that had pretty far-reaching impact in terms of higher oil prices and all kinds of crazy things just from that one attack. So I would probably say go after the low-hanging fruit first. Make sure that you've got a good cybersecurity framework in place. Be aware of what your attack surface actually is, and then it's really basic things. It's like, you know, making sure that all your remote services are properly secured, up to date. The operating systems are patched. You don't have any, you know, obvious vulnerabilities in the software or anything like that. Strong single-use passwords. Don't use shared passwords. That's a pretty obvious one. And two-factor authentication. So, you know, you can get all the bells and whistles later on, but often it's just shoring up kind of the basic defenses, which is going to give you the most bang for buck. So I'd say, yeah, it's that cyber maturity and cyber hygiene, which is the biggest thing for a lot of organizations.
So thanks very much, Gareth. And I think a lot of what Gareth pointed to, Rachael, relates to your priorities and your focus as in shifting the culture, cybersecurity culture within an organization. How do you do it? So how do we achieve that? How we can shift the culture within the high level, senior level of an organization who may have alternative priorities? I mean, their focus and agenda, it's not cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is obviously mostly a burden. So how do you achieve that culture shift?
Oh, it's such a good question. It's the $1 million question, isn't it? How do we prevent these pesky carbon operating systems, otherwise known as humans, from having all those undocumented features that they all seem to have? Look, this is exactly what keeps me up at night. I wonder if we need to take a step back as a cohort, so whether that be industry, government or academia, and I've been lucky enough to have my foot in each one of those camps. And how do we actually define cybercrime? What is cybercrime? Where do we get that unified approach to understanding that? If we take the word cyber out of the conversation and say, what is crime? It's a really good analogy for us to use in this conversation, because here's my question. Getting my $25 Kmart bike stolen off the front porch is crime. I may well have 2 police officers in a very expensive, very cool looking car, probably with blue lights on the top. All to be fair, they're not going to be flashing when they rock up. But when I get my $25 bike stolen off the porch, somebody in a uniform will come there, they will write a report, they will tell me how unfortunate that is. I can then go to an insurance company, do whatever it is that I need to do. Murder is also a crime. Sure, I will have the police car turn up, this time probably with flashing lights. But we've got to look at the scale of crime, right from having my $25 Kfart bike stolen right through to murder. Are we having those same conversations around cyber crime? Because we, holistically, as a cohort, cannot be everything to everyone, and we need to think about how we might prioritise. So how do we, that's what keeps me up at night. How do we define cyber crime, and where are the priorities for us as industry, as academia and as governments to put our focus, and where is that alignment, where are those synergies? And the other thing that keeps me up at night is those pesky carbon operating systems, so the people. How do we, when we solution, embed security, and gosh, there's a whole nother conversation to have around safety, but how do we embed that into the solutions that we create? So when we are developing products, when we are developing solutions, how do we make security seamless? It's like when you go and drive your car, there's no one there going, hang on a minute, better make sure you've got to check your brake pads, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. all we have to do is make sure that we put petrol in the car, unless it's a diesel, in which case you will learn a very, very hard lesson very quickly. But how might we change the conversation that we're having? It's not all about tech controls. It's about how do we help people start doing something, and in actual fact, more of the conversation needs to be around how do we get people to stop doing some of the things that they've been doing more traditionally to enable a more secure environment for us to operate. So they're the things that keep me up at night. And as far as embedding culture into the organisation, it's really about understanding what are those crown jewels, what are the priorities, what's important to us as an organisation, and how do we put a security framework around that that helps mitigate the risk but doesn't close everything down so that we can't operate. That's a really good question.
Perfect. Thanks very much, and very insightful. So I'm conscious of time, and we have a whole lot of questions and limited time. So I'll just move on. Vaughan, perhaps you can start. We can start with this question. So Vaughan, how has the COVID-19 changed the cybersecurity landscape? So yeah, I'm just curious to know in your role. So how have things changed since COVID-19, and how do you deal with them?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, this has driven a trend for remote work. And yeah, as I alluded to previously, that means a lot of hastily erected infrastructure. And I think for the customers we deal with, which are the blue teams that are trying to defend this digital terrain, this means the size of their problem space just got a whole lot bigger. And it also means that for the people rolling out these solutions, and let's face it, if you've got an entire workforce, thousands of people sort of sent home overnight on, when was it, March the 17th last year, and some of them didn't even really have laptops to work from, like you would actually have to, have BYOD type situations where they're using their own computers. And I think what's really happened, I think it's the realization has dawned that that anyone who's setting up infrastructure really needs to be very cognizant of security. I feel like that's something we should have known already, but it's never quite been driven home until now, that when all this infrastructure is remote. The other component here is thinking a bit about the remote work situation. Now, you can, for example, set up a VPN so that all of your staff can VPN in and basically have like effectively a hard outer shell to get into their corporate network and access the resources they need to do their job. That unfortunately doesn't work so well in the modern world with running a lot of platform-based solutions hosted by third parties, so SaaS solutions. And there's this other idea. I guess the other issue is that if your VPN is compromised, so there's this assumption that your VPN is secure, and as Gareth mentioned earlier with Colonial Pipeline, once that VPN is compromised, all of the flimsy security you had inside that hard outer shell is suddenly exposed, and the attacker can move laterally around your network and grab what they need or what they want. So there's this other idea that's been I think it was promulgated by Google originally. They called it Beyond Corp. It's since morphed into this thing called Zero Trust. In military terminology, they call it defense in depth. And the idea is that you don't really have a border on your network. You don't say, here's the VPN, it's soft and mushy in the middle and hard on the outside. We say, actually, we're going to harden everything and there will be no perimeter. Okay, so rather than trying to put up a big fence to keep the attackers out, it's more like, and I'm going to go back to military analogies here, more like having a series of machine gun pits or trenches that go back, so that if you get through the first one, there's more guns waiting, at the next step. So the defenders have to think in this layered kind of manner, and that's actually driven a lot of product innovation in terms of how we implement networks that are secure, at different levels within. How we verify people's identities as well. Or people or processes, how we verify their identity and then grant them only the access control they need to proceed past the checkpoint to the resource that they're accessing. So that's a very, very technical description. I would say final comment on that is something that I think hasn't really been explored yet in too much detail is the flimsiness of these home networks that we're all using, right? We're all on them right now. if you think about the devices that are on your home network, you've got several like tablet PCs, maybe you've got some phones on there, that smart TV, the smart fridge. What a cool idea. Let's put, thinking sand inside a fridge and connect it to the internet. All of this stuff can be used as an attack vector to get into your home network. Now you might think, why would anyone attack a home network? And well, the answer is they can stalk you on social media and find out who you work for and say, if I want to get into this corporation, I just need to find one employee with an insecure home network and find a way to that network. This is exactly how LinkedIn got breached. They found an employee at LinkedIn who was a systems administrator, so a person with a high level of privileged access. That person was hosting their own personal website off I think it was a Mac Mini, an unpatched, in fact it was a fully patched Mac Mini that they had running in their home, and connecting out to the internet. And because the sysadmin is quite diligent, their home hosted website was quite secure. But they were hosting another website for a mate on the same machine, and that was insecure. And so the hackers were able to actually get in through that website, pop a shell onto the web server, move laterally inside the Mac Mini. They were able to jump onto the person's work laptop, which was on the same home network. The work laptop had unsecured secure shell keys in there. So just keys sitting in your authorized keys file, or your SSH file. And from there, they're able to log into LinkedIn through the proper method, impersonating that admin, and get full access to everybody's LinkedIn data. So I just don't, I haven't heard much around, whether this is being used in a COVID-19 situation. If I were a nation state actor, I would be doing this. I wouldn't be making a big noise about it. It would be very covert. It's not about, ransoming or, leaking data on the dark web. It's about preparing the battle space. Right? We just simply don't know what that big iceberg, that 9/10 of the iceberg of nation state activity, what is going on out there. So just thinking like an attacker, that's what I would be doing. And I'm sure it's going on.
No, that LinkedIn story was really interesting, and perhaps what I find is sort of the IoT also aspect that you mentioned. We don't have much regulation when it comes to IoT that we import from all sorts of manufacturers from all over the world. I know that some countries have made some attempts, and so yeah, regulation, technology, human aspect all need to work hand in hand to perhaps for us to tackle these growing cybersecurity threats. But again, I'm conscious of time, and I know we have questions, so I'll just have I'll move on to another question, which would be very interesting to hear your insights about, which is essentially how we can improve the connection between Australian universities and cyber industry. So especially within the context of this HBR conference, we have future graduates who will be, future researchers who will lead innovation as part of startups, maybe like Vaughan, or as academics. So how do you see how do you think we can achieve a better or improvement in that aspect? So maybe Rachael, would you like to share your insights?
Oh, absolutely. It's a good question. I like these ones. It's the C word. It's as simple as that. Collaborate. I think we need to get better at these type of conversations. I think we need to get better at understanding what the skills of the future might look like, understanding what the threats that are coming over the horizon might look like, and working together to ensure that researchers are providing industry and government with the insights that are needed to make well-informed decisions, because we can't protect what we don't know, and we can't make decisions unless we have the right information and the right data there. So I'm really keen for us to explore how we build those relationships. And ironically, I think some of that is actually through reaching out to one another. Be bold, I think, as students. And one of the reasons I love leaning into these type of conversations is because what students bring to the table is new thinking, fresh set of eyes. We call ourselves experts, but at the end of the day, just as we are seeing cyber criminals collaborating and innovating, we need to do that too, and maybe change the conversation about being so reactionary and look at what are some of those proactive research activities that we can do to help shape and influence how industry and the startup ecosystem and governments will help create those informed decisions. So I think that's probably first and foremost, is collaborating and having the right conversations across all three cohorts.
No, that sounds spot on, I think. And perhaps, Gareth, how we can achieve that collaboration, so how we can facilitate that interaction, or maybe it's also sometimes about what sort of research would you expect maybe universities to focus on, or what's by what sort? I don't mean especially just topics, maybe the topics we all know, but how do you see the research that we do in a university setting to be applicable to what you do and the threats that you face in your business or in your role, Gareth?
Yeah, thanks, Suresh. I think Rachel touched on some pretty good points, but I guess the key thing is, the thing Rachel mentioned, a lot of cybersecurity is a little bit reactive, but the reality is it's an incredibly dynamic space. The cyber criminals are not stupid people, very, very, very smart people. It's evolving very quickly. We need to counter that with trying to be proactive and not looking at what's an issue now, but what's an issue around the corner that we need to be thinking about. There's a lot of things coming that I've mentioned some of the key trends which were kind of unheard of maybe even 6 months ago. Some of the things we're seeing, it's evolving pretty rapidly. We think about what's happening in the technology space as well, not just in the people space, and thinking about machine learning and AI and quantum computing and all these types of things. There's going to be a whole new raft of challenges coming. And it's really, really hard to predict, as I said, even 6 months ahead, let alone 1 or 2 years ahead. So I think from a university perspective, plugging into industry is really important. Finding out what's going on. I'd say to all the students, you should be kind of across what's happening in the industry. So if you can be going to ACER events and things like that, following companies and key people on LinkedIn. Listening to podcasts, so really understand what's going on in the industry. But yeah, also, if you're on sort of Reddit groups and things like that, just really trying to understand, I guess, what's new and emerging. And in terms of sort of how universities and industry can be working better together, I think it's, having those discussions and collaboration, and these types of things are great. Having more sort of panels, having roundtables, things like that. But just, I guess that would be my sort of key thoughts, is just try to really be on top of and plug into what's going on in this industry, because the reality is the cybersecurity industry is desperately short of talent. So you probably heard it all the time. We have a major skills shortage. There's new roles popping up all the time, there's not enough people to fill them. So we need really smart people, but it's not about just having one particular skill set. It's about probably having that critical thinking and having that fluid intelligence and ability to kind of react to new things that are going on. And probably I'd say this is something, maybe I wish I'd been told when I was at university, is what you learn at university is great, but there's sometimes a little bit of a disconnect between what happens in the industry and what happens in academia. So kind of understanding what employers want is really important as well. And, looking at maybe some of those softer skills rather than just technical knowledge. So understanding people, understanding how to be proactive, do your research about companies, And a really important one is actually is knowing how to actually, this is probably pivoting a little bit more into how students can actually get into the industry, but is actually learning how to sell yourself as well, which is kind of a key thing that I don't think you really do learn at uni, but it's a good thing to know. So those are my thoughts.
No, thanks very much. A few different major points, I would say, Gareth, and I think the soft skills are actually quite critical, and perhaps I think I can ask my next question to Vaughan, because it's actually very related maybe to his experience. So he has been a PhD student at RMIT, and he has moved to industry. So just like an example for our HDR conference attendees today. So how did you make it happen? And in general, if I were to make it a generic question, how would you see PhD candidates, PhD students in general engaging with industry to achieve maybe what you achieved and so on? So really keen to hear your thoughts, Vaughan.
Yeah, thanks, Arash. So yeah, I'll share a bit about my journey. I started my PhD at RMIT in 2000. It was a 4-year journey. Got there in the end. It was a struggle. So my heart goes out to all of you there. I know how difficult it can be. So I can totally relate. And I know that a lot of the time you're working in relative isolation, and you do wonder if what you're doing is does anyone really care? I suppose is the question I kept thinking about as I was doing mine. And you start off with this grand vision, this hubris that I'm going to change the world with my research and make a lasting impact. And then eventually, I just want to get my thesis accepted. That's literally the only thing I care about. How many publications I need to rack up to do that. Along the way, you do learn a lot of resilience. This is, I think, by far and away, if you can stick through a PhD candidature and achieve that degree, that is proof that you can stick at a thing, a very unknown thing that no one else has done before, and achieve that outcome through just self-imposed discipline. It forces you to do a lot of deep analytical thinking, to become a subject matter expert on a particular topic, and I would encourage you to think about when you're writing for your PhD, when you're writing papers, and when you're presenting at conferences, think of it as opportunities to work on your skills as an orator, as a presenter, and as a writer, and that's really quite understated. And I think anyone who's been in cybersecurity for any length of time will recognise that how you influence people in the way you present and the way you write is critically important. There's no point doing amazing work if you can't actually use it to bring about change. So the skills you're going to learn in the PhD, you will learn to write far better than most people. When you get those drafts back with the red ink all over them, I suppose nowadays you get red highlights from it was red ink back in my day, always on paper, usually some coffee stains on there as well. That brutal process you're going through is training you to be a better communicator. So I encourage you to lean into that and enjoy the burn, because it will pay off big time later in your career. For me, I didn't actually leap straight out of the PhD into industry. I actually went to government, and I did that. I actually moved to Canberra and worked in the Department of Defence, in a government agency. I think at the time I finished my PhD, I felt a strong sense of patriotism. This was in 2004. I wanted to make a difference, and I honestly didn't know where I'd fit in industry. Most of the people I knew in industry were just building stuff or servicing products, and I didn't really get where a PhD would fit. The government had shown some interest in my research, and I thought that seems like the place to throw my resume. So that's where I landed. I think it's it's a lot of people do think about academia as an ends in and of itself, and that's fine. We do need good teachers to continue to train people and bring them through. We need that research, but do consider industry, and maybe a way to sort of dip your toe in the water is to do an internship. So we've had a couple of interns at Cydarm, one most recently, just sort of wrapping up at the moment. And what it does, it gives you exposure to what it's like to work in a team. That's probably something you're lacking right now if you're beavering away solo on a research project. You get to work in a team. You get to bring that creativity and those communication skills to bear on a problem within a private enterprise, and that's, I think, useful to have that diversity on a team, to have someone with a different approach, and really where I see the value is PhD candidates are deep thinkers. You can go deep on a topic, read the literature, come up with ideas, propose solutions. A lot of developers don't have time for that. Right? A lot of developers are trained to look at a ticket, right? Understand what they're being asked to build, and then build it. Okay, here's a sketch of an application. I want you to build the application, right? Put the data in the database, get the data out of the database, make it reliable. Okay, not so much about about that solutioneering where you're actually looking at a complex problem and trying to solve it. So I think definitely any exposure you can get is good. It will give you, I guess, some relevancy, maybe open your mind a bit to what you might do when you finish your PhD candidacy. And then in terms of collaboration more broadly, I think there are a lot of problems. I feel like this is something we don't do especially well in Australia. I think in the US, maybe they do it slightly better. It's something we can work on. And I would certainly like to be part of that solution, working with universities. And it's about finding the gaps in what we can do in the private sector. So these sort of longer term or more complex problems. One that I'm grappling with a lot is interpretation of standards. So we look a lot at standards for how you should do cybersecurity, very technical documents. How do you bring that into product form factor? How do you make that available? I need someone to understand those standards and interpret them, and maybe even extend them where necessary. And that requires an analytical mindset. Obviously, things involving data science, machine learning, that's kind of a pretty straightforward application. But a lot of successful collaboration is about aligning incentives or making sure every party gets what they want. So I run a business, intellectual property is important to me, making revenue is important, and serving my customers. So that's what I'm focused on. In academia, you're focused on publishing novel and unique research. So the question is, what novel and unique research can you work on, or maybe an industry-based project that has a research component that we're happy to publish in public, that will serve both our interests. I think that's where the challenge lies, identifying those special situations and aligning people to work on those problems together.
Thanks very much, and I think you'll get many LinkedIn connections and some emails soon with our students who would want to come for an internship. So just to let you know in advance after that. But yeah, thanks very much.
Arash, we are a 10-person company, so we can't absorb. I'd love to hire all of the people here as interns, but we have limited capacity.
No, I'm just kidding here. I think it's not just through the internships, but other sorts of collaborations through the center and other exploration that I think we can focus on. So I'll just ask maybe Rachael and Gareth for 30 seconds wrap up, as in what sort of generic advice you may have to our PhD students here who and I think that will leave us 5 or 6, 10 minutes hopefully of question time. So Rachael.
Thank you. I'm going to be really quick on this one. I think Vaughan has summed it up really brilliantly. The ability for you to reach out to us. And let's be honest, we all love this stuff. I think all of us will talk about cybersecurity all day and all night, preferably underwater if we can. Reach out to us, leverage those socials, tell us what's so awesome about you and the work that you're doing, because I think maybe sometimes, and to Vaughan's point, working autonomously, deep down in the weeds on what you're doing, I'm really keen to hear about the work that you're doing, and to Vaughan's point, please don't inundate me with all sorts of things, but reach out, leverage those socials, like Gareth spoke about, Reddit forums, write blogs about the work that you're doing, be disruptive in the way that you engage with the industry and government, because we are keen to see all the awesome work that's going on. And to Gareth's point, there's a shortage of skills. So if you can really show and demonstrate the thought diversity that you bring into the tent, then that just creates a whole heap of options for you. So that's it from me. Over to you, Gareth.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rachael, and thanks, Arash. Yeah, look, I'd second a lot of what Vaughan and Rachael have said. I think you really need to just put yourself out there. There is a skills shortage. Industry desperately looking for, smart people, but they also need. It's also hard to know if somebody's going to be the right fit. So I think there's a little bit of a false dichotomy sometimes between academic knowledge and practical knowledge. I think both of them are really important. I think as what you can probably bring to the table is, as Vaughan mentioned, outside the box thinking. You haven't been indoctrinated into a particular mold of thinking that, a lot of corporations, that people have been there a long time, they get a bit rigid minded, I think, in some ways. So bringing that fresh perspective, having that open-mindedness, but just putting yourself out there. So when you do talk to people, you can really demonstrate what you're able to bring to the table. And it could be, as Rachael said, write a blog or something, do something public, have a project that you can kind of present. An internship is probably a good idea. But yeah, just really try to put yourself out there and plug into what's going on in the sort of industry and outside of academia, and yeah, I think you'll be putting yourself in a good position.
Thanks very much, guys. I think some very good suggestions there for us to reflect on how we can improve our the way we approach industry with, or maybe how we can also best prepare for a possible industry career to Vaughan's suggestion. So thanks very much to all of our panelists. So I'll just highlight that there have been so many messages and comments in the chat section. But again, I'm conscious of time, and with that, I'll just highlight one of the questions, and perhaps if others wanted to ask questions, if they want to interact, they can raise their hand and ask the question directly to our panel members. So one of the questions is actually directed to you, Vaughan, by Shah. So considering the dynamic nature of cyber attacks, wouldn't be these the regulations that you mentioned, wouldn't they need to be dynamic as well? So any sort of thoughts on that? I think we all agree they need to be, but and the changes perhaps that we see all around the world are indicate that need. But any thoughts or additions?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So thank you, Shah. And I will say, so the first part of that question, the trade-offs, yes, there are trade-offs. As soon as you regulate, you create an incentive framework, and that can have unintended consequences. So we need to be very careful to bring these things in gradually and to make sure. And there has been some consultation, shall we say, with the current SOCI amendments that came through. I was present for some of that, and it was at times pretty adversarial. But certainly making sure that you have at least some buy-in and you can somewhat predict the behavior that that's going to arise from the regulations, and look for any loopholes. In terms of the dynamic nature, yes, this is a big problem. I was perusing the draft of the bill, and I noticed that they have specific mention of domain names in there. I think that's a mistake. I think mentioning specific technologies is going to rapidly date any regulations you have, and no greater example of this than the Telecommunications Act of 1980, whatever it was. So I actually worked on some legislation while I was employed by the government as a technical advisor, and we had this exact problem. People had put into legislation that when we do telecommunications interception, we go to the carriage service, say Telstra, and basically we ring them up on the telephone and we say, I've got a warrant here and I'm going to bring it around to your office. I need you to put alligator clips on here, or tell the operator to connect this plug board, and we're going to listen to the mobster, like having their covert conversation. Then you flash forward to the early 2000s, and it's like they're talking on Facebook now. Okay, we'll go and tell Telstra we need to get the data. It's like, well, Telstra doesn't own the data. They own the carriage service. They don't care what they're carrying. You can be on Facebook, Twitter, looking at websites. It's like Telstra can't give you that data. Because they don't you know, they don't own it. They don't understand the data. They're just carrying the packets. So I think, yes, we have to be very careful with regulation that we don't date ourselves too quickly. And obviously there was a very long, there was like a almost 2 years lead time getting this current bill. They had to split the bill in half to pass half of it this week. And I think, you know, you only get one shot at this stuff for maybe, you know, the next 5 years or a decade. So yeah, it's a problem.
No, I think that's very interesting, but I'll just have to move on to the next question. I wish we had more time. So there was one comment by Jonathan that I think, Rachel, is interesting. A chain is only as strong as the weakest link. We know that in cyber. So it's always been sort of commonly referred to as people being the weakest in the cybersecurity chain. But recently, I've been seeing some academic papers, especially technical ones, referring to IoT being the weakest element in the chain. So I think from your perspective, we still think humans are the weakest in the cybersecurity chain. Is that correct, or has that changed? I'm just being silly here. I don't know. But yeah, what are your thoughts with that?
Yeah. Thanks, Arash. It's an interesting one, isn't it? And thanks, Jonathan, for kind of calling that out. Look, I think traditionally we still talk about humans being the weakest link, and you know, maybe there is an argument that we can use that with, but humans are also our greatest defense. So, you know, we can look at the glass being half empty, or we can look at the glass half full. And it kind of talks to some of the other things that have been mentioned in the chat here around soft skills. And like, let's be honest, I call them power skills as opposed to soft skills. We spoke about it through the conversation today, you know, that ability to have an adaptive mindset. So both Gareth and Vaughan have spoken about how quickly the threat landscape is moving and reshaping. So you need to be able to be resilient. You also need to have that critical thinking. You need to be able to remain calm in a storm. These type of skills are really, really important. And then it goes back to, again, solutioning for the right audience. So throwing a technical capability in and making people adhere to it is just going to create workarounds. So it goes back again to saying, how do we embed solutions that are secure and safe by design? So moving that security to the left when we're talking to our developers and our solution architects and so on and so forth. But then also leveraging all of that research and those insights that we have to see how we shift the narrative from saying, don't click on a link. Well, that's a really silly thing to say, because even for today, I had to click on a link to come into this conversation with an untrusted source. So we have to define and create a narrative that actually suits with the way that humans interact and operate, instead of trying to plug in at the end a solution that is secure but hasn't been thought through in the design phase. So yes, they're your weakest link, but also your greatest defense. We've just got to change the way that we look at them.
That's a great
By them,
point.
I mean people.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I think we can wrap up with one last question, Gareth, and then I'll just pass on to Zahir for the final concluding words to wrap up today's conference. So Gareth, Zahir, who would be wrapping up the session, had actually asked a question at the very start when I think you were referring to the risks such as ransomware, how to deal with state-sponsored attacks. I think that's we need a whole session for that, but maybe, you know, some quick thoughts. You know, as a major organization, ANC, for example, I'm sure they have this worry about state-sponsored attacks. So how you know, how do we deal with that? And that we don't have time.
Sure.
Very quickly.
My take on that's probably a little bit cynical. Unfortunately, I genuinely think if you're an organisation that a state actor, sophisticated state actor, wants to go after, there's not that much you can actually do to prevent it. But I think you've got to make yourself as secure as you can. That's all you can do. So, you know, there's been a lot of talk as part of this discussion around what security actually means. It's not looking at one thing. I think it's taking a holistic approach. It's taking a mindset. It's having that security in depth. It's looking at all the potential areas of your security policy, and sometimes that's not just your technology, sometimes that's your people, it's the mindset, it's your sort of the way you think about things. I think you can make it more difficult for state actors to go after you, but I know enough about state-sponsored attacks from all sides that there's actually very, very little you can do against them. I think probably the bigger concern for most organizations is not making themselves easy targets. So yeah, if a state sponsor is a university, it's probably a very relevant thing. I think you can certainly make it a lot more difficult, but I think the level of sophistication that a serious state actor would have means whatever security policies you put in place or measures, they have the resources to find a way around them. So that's my honest answer. It's probably not what you want to hear, but yeah, it's just trying to make make it as good as you can. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we don't have anything as 100% security. So great wrap up. So and so I think you put together everything very nicely, all the topics covered. So I would just like to once again thanks to all of you. Thanks you, Rachael, Vaughan, and Gareth for making the time today. It was great to hear your insights. So I'll just pass on to Zahir. I saw you won for a second.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you all for the panel. I mean, it was a great discussion. Thank you, Rachael. Thank you, Gareth. Thank you, Vaughan. It was great. I know these problems are complicated, right? And maybe we need to have a whole symposium about that, probably a half day, right? I mean, it's just like, I think it's very hard to talk, but you did a great job. I mean, you covered different aspects, from technology to skills and so on. Great, thank you very much, and thank you, Arash. And I have to say also, I have to thank also the previous presenters who did a great job. So hopefully we'll see you, probably we'll try to see how we can really stay connected with you, because you are a great asset for us, and how you can really impact our students as well and our programs and so on. So if you want to attend, we have another session tomorrow. I know you are very busy, right? We have some presentation from the HDR conference for tomorrow from 9:30 as well. But if you're interested, we can send you links, and it would be great if you can attend it. You can get feedback to our students as well. Again, thank you very much, and hope to see you all. And thank you, Arash, as well, for organizing, for chairing the panel.
Thanks everyone. So as I mentioned, tomorrow we have the next some also a very interesting session by Australian Signals Director, so ASD. So just don't miss that one. I think it would be very interesting for our attendees. Thanks everyone. Thanks to our panel.
Thank you everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys.
Bye.